Some papers came from KR and semantic web. Some papers came from recommender systems and matrix factorization. Some papers came from crowdsourcing. They were just a wide variety of papers. So when we started thinking about this track, the biggest problem was how do we even find a good program committee? Because I had some idea about NLP and a little bit about crowdsourcing, and Evgeny knew more about information retrieval and so on. But we couldn't cover all the areas ourselves. So we used a two-pronged approach to recruit the PC members. We very carefully recruited the SPC members who covered all the areas that we were thinking about. We had our own lists of trusted PC members that we invited, and then we asked each of our SPC members to invite their list of trusted PC members. So that way we hope that we would be able to have broad enough, large enough and trusted enough program committee, and it worked to a certain extent, definitely. The second issue was that there is a border between the main track and the AI and web track. Some papers could potentially be sent to both because they are starting from a core foundational model and are applying it to web, or they are web papers using a certain AI technique. You can look at it both ways. So we went back and forth between should we post-process the papers to move between the main and AI web track or not. And we eventually decided that if an author has submitted to a certain track, then we would let it be. But towards the very end, we realized that there were some papers in the main track which would have gained from the AI and web reviewing, and there were some one or two papers in the AI and web track which would have gained from the main reviewing. So towards the very end, we had more of an information transfer between each other, between Rao, myself, Evgeny, and some of these senior members and area chairs. But maybe we should do it ahead of time. That's a question for you guys as you think about the AI and web track. And then finally, once the papers were done, the review was done, the decisions were made, and I'm going to talk about various issues that came up in that reviewing process. So one thing that I have learned is that in any reviewing, there is a period of time when for everybody there is a period of time which is very highly constrained. So if you are a program committee member, it's the day before the reviewing deadline. Because we know that almost all papers get reviewed on the last day. And then some after the last day, and very, very few, like 10% before the reviewing deadline. Now, sorry for a little bit of a cynical view here, but this is very practical. This is what you observe in the data, unfortunately. So imagine that you had 6 papers and all the 6 papers were reviewed on the last day. Well, what to imagine? Just imagine what you did 3 months back. So you can visualize what does that do with respect to the quality of the reviewing. I mean, some people can absorb a lot of ideas on the last day. Maybe some people are just writing reviews on the last day. They just read the papers 1 month back and their memory is so good that they remember exactly what they read. But really, more often than not, those reviews are not always homogeneously high quality. Similarly, after the rebuttal phase, there is a period of time when they all have to come together to discuss. An SPC member has to be present to encourage the discussion. Later, the area chair looks at those papers at a specific point in time, and then at a specific point in time, the track chairs make the decisions. And those points are very, very strict in some sense. There are very limited windows because we have to cover the whole reviewing in a limited time. So one thing that I have learned is to identify those times and make sure that I block my calendar. But we can't necessarily force everybody to do this, and that was a problem. Because some of our really carefully chosen SPC members also were absent for the important part of the discussion phase where we would have hoped them to be very highly contributive. And later they came back, but then the PC member had gone away somewhere, and so really the discussion that should have happened in some of the papers could not happen in spite of our best efforts. The other thing that I have felt, and this is, and people have brought it up, is a reviewing style thing. I came from planning community once upon a time. We used to have this beautiful rebuttal phase, then everybody will discuss this paper at length, and Rao's slides showed that. And later when I started track chairing NLP conferences, they are like, why should we need a rebuttal? We should just get rid of the rebuttal. So they are slowly, not everybody, I mean there are exceptional people, but they are believing that rebuttals are not useful. And why do they feel rebuttals are not useful? Because the reviewers are not really thinking about the rebuttals, they are not really discussing the rebuttals very much, so therefore they are not useful, right? So it's a question, I mean it's a difference in the way they look at it. NLP is a little bit more, again within NLP somewhat heterogeneous community, there is no one track, everybody does their thing and eventually some major ideas emerge, but the process is slightly more Brownian, whereas for something like planning it is a little bit more linear. And so because of that, what I have seen is that people who do more applied research for some reason, especially reviewers, are a little bit more inflexible in their opinion and moreover not willing to engage in discussion. Or, statistically, there are always exceptions again. So when you write them a request to discuss, a typical response is, I have read the rebuttal and I hold my views. And that's the end of it. And it becomes really, really hard to get them to talk to each other and look at each person's reviews, understand. And I don't know exactly what we can do to mediate this, but this is an issue that I have seen. Some of the quality issues also happen because people write sort of 2 lines or 3 lines about what they did not like. So I have learned that when I write reviews, I start with these are the strengths of the paper, these are the weaknesses of the paper at a very high level. And then I can go on into specific details. And maybe one possible suggestion would be to make the review form such that every reviewer is forced to say something in the column of what are good things about this paper at a high level, and some things about what are the negative things about that paper again at a high level, and then they can give more detailed feedback both to the authors and the program committee. Finally, very often really good reviewers, well-known people from our community ask their students to write reviews, and it is good, it is important for the students to learn, but at the end of the day, they are, the original PC members are responsible for the reviews, and students may not always engage in the right way, and usually students start out being on an extreme. Well, depends. Some students think everything is bad, some students don't have a very good understanding initially and they can't make a decision, so they are always in the middle. And so this always in the extreme and always in the middle kind of a student needs to be taught a little bit and mentored a little bit, which is our job as mentors, but we have to do this actively, and sometimes the advisors don't because they haven't read the paper, they haven't found time to read the paper, and the PhD student is reviewing. So these are all the issues that I think as a community we need to figure out. And I will just make one last comment. We had a specific case where one of the papers was alleged to be plagiarized by an archive paper written by some other authors. And we did a lot of effort, put a lot of effort in it, and finally recognized that there is potential plagiarism here, and we took this out of the proceedings. But that gave me 2 insights that showed to me that actually presence of the archive paper allowed us to figure this out. In fact, it was time-stamped to be before the submission deadline. And so that was very clear to us that if there is plagiarism, it's only one way, because that paper, it's most likely one way because that paper is already on archive and that we can check. And second, I felt that if something like that is happening, and I later went on and figured out that in the paper there were also plagiarism from their own previous paper, which was very close and so on. So there may be a possibility that we just run the Turnitin or some kind of a software which initially checks for plagiarism for all papers. And some authors will be unhappy because I'm sure some of us have used our own text in the past, and it will become a little bit subjective. But I think this is a good practice for us, just to make sure that some papers don't sneak in which have these issues. In this particular case, it was somebody else's paper. They observed it in time. They reached out and so on. So I have spoken a lot. So I will say just one last thing. I have many points, but I will say just one last thing. Actually, 2 last things, not from AI and web perspective. So one thing that I'm really fond of from the NLP community is their focus on releasing code, data, and putting that as a reviewing item in the review. Is there any impact of the resources? And that really helps the NLP community to move forward because it's a fairly applied community, but also helps us in reproducibility of work. I remember Rob Holte talking about in the invited talk that somebody made some claims and he never checked that those claims are correct or not, kinds of things. If we had the code with the data, then we would be able to reproduce anybody's work much faster and the progress will happen much faster. Now I know that some companies may have an issue with this because they can't release code, and we shouldn't say that it is absolutely necessary that you release code, but if you do, that should add as a small plus when we do reviewing, and especially when we are treating the borderline papers. So that would be my suggestion to the community, that we should think about as many more papers get written, as so much is going on. We don't want to be spending time re-implementing somebody else's work and not getting the same results and then having to argue it in the paper. We should just have code that we can quickly run and get results. And lastly, people were talking about this spinning wheel of fortune. Ra was talking about this, and I have a very concrete suggestion there. Again, it's for the program committee members to think about, that we create a mechanism where there is some continuity of reviewing across conferences, and at least for the IIII organized hosted conferences in IJCAI, we can have this mechanism where we can check from the past 2 years of submitted papers if the paper is fairly close to one, and then we go back, we bring up that thread of the reviewing, and maybe even ask one reviewer from that set of 3 to come and represent that paper and add one review in this conference, so that a little bit of continuity is maintained. At the same time, 1 or 2 new people should definitely read the paper, because we don't want one bad reviewer once upon a time to keep killing the paper ad infinitum. So we need to find this balance, but we do see some papers that just kept getting sent, and if you have a small enough probability that you will get accepted by randomness, then after 5 or 6 trials, then the probability is very high that you will get it. It's a simple probability here. So these are my suggestions. Thank you.
Hi, as Rahul said, my perspective is that of someone who was the program co-chair for IIII 2016, so I had some fresh experience on a lot of these very specific points that were fresh in my mind, but maybe now with the passage of time, it maybe seems more relevant to step back at some of the broader impressions from that experience. I was an avid reader of Rao's blog, which it's amazing that he had time to do this while he was running the IJCAI review process. I enjoyed it quite a lot, and maybe some of the enjoyment came, I admit, from the fact that these were not my problems to deal with, but his. But most of them, the observations really rang true with the experience that I had as well. And the number one in that regard is what a massive effort it is. It's an ad hoc organization of, in the case of IJCAI 2000, in our case about 1,200 people from scratch. I mean, obviously there's experience and relationships, but it's a new organization, not totally calibrated to each other, very heterogeneous in expertise in area and seniority and perspective and experience with this particular conference and others. And they do their work in a very intense period under strict deadlines, which many have commented on, under a lot of decision making under stress. And then the notifications go out and they disband, and it's all over. It's a crazy way to do things. I don't think we would design it on purpose that way, but it's also hard to see how you evolve smoothly from that, at least for a conference like this. So despite all the real limitations of that, I think we do a very good job considering. In fact, the IIII 2016, all of the papers that we accepted were better than all of the papers that we rejected. Okay, I felt obliged to say something absolutely ridiculous as part of the panel. It would be blatantly false if it were meaningful at all. Of course, the process is very imperfect. How could it really be otherwise? When it's so dispersed, so decentralized, so diffused, you have so many people doing small pieces of the work. We should not really expect much consistency. There's a lot of good ideas about best practices that I think can improve things at the margin, as had some policy changes that can improve things at the margin, and by all means we should do them all. But frankly, it's not going to get that much better. And So what do we do about that? Well, one thing I think we should do, to be a little provocative, is say maybe we should admit that the evidence of a paper being accepted at HLI or AAAI or any of the top conferences is not all that we sometimes make it out to be. Certainly, and I think that the competitive nature of CS conference locations has served us well in some respects. But taken to extremes, when everyone is really, when some at least are really optimizing only for that, it leads to a lot of perversions and distortions, which are not really great for the way we communicate as a field. So I hope at least that if we admitted that a little bit more often in forums like this, some more might back off from the hyper-optimizing version of the competition anyway, and focus more on long-term communication, long-form publication. Places where you can have review processes. They're not constrained the way that, that these conference review processes are constrained.
Okay, so as Raul mentioned earlier, I was last year's HCAI's PC chair. And as Raul asked me to be on the panel, I started reflecting on what happened last year in relation to this question. So let's first look at some of the digests from last year's statistics, just to remind ourselves, because I believe some people here was were in Argentina, but many of you may not be there, or so it's good to reflect on what was last year's situation. So like this year, we had a lot of submissions last year, and one of the hallmarks of HCAI is that it's truly international. The submissions are from many different countries. But another thing is, given that we have so many submissions, the area where these papers are distributed are not uniform. In fact, it's heavily long tail. So here is the number of submissions versus number of accepted papers, and you can see that the distribution is highly skewed. So like this year, we had a double-blind submission process. We had an author feedback process. Unlike this year, we used CompMaster. And our review process was a blind review. Above the reviewer, the PC members, there's the SPC, and above the SPC, there's the area chair. So one thing, I think like Raul, we made sure that there's a single line of responsibility. We believe that this is the only way to responsibly handle such a large number of tasks. So after the PC members finish their reviews, the SPC in charge will take a serious look, leave comments, and the same thing happens with the area chair in sequence. Okay, so this is a very quick review of the whole process, which transpired in half a year time. But there are many hiccups in the process. So I remember one of the emergencies, we had several of them, was because of the CompMaster was not able to scale up to the level of the number of submissions. But one thing that I remember we did particularly well, given such a large number of submissions, is that each reviewer had only a small number of papers to look at, and that, I believe, gave each reviewer more time to reflect on the paper, gave more time on the discussion period, and one thing was we urged all the reviewers to respond to the comments in the feedback process, at least to acknowledge the author's feedback. Okay, so So some of the things is how, so one thing we are still thinking hard is we are a general conference, and how do we set it apart from some of the specialized conferences like in machine learning or KR. And as we know, people, authors, may set their priorities such that their best papers are submitted instead to these specialized conferences. How do we grab these papers back? Or how do we attract the papers that can be more beneficial in a general conference? That is, address a general integrated AI perspective. Okay, so another thing is how to keep the reviewing load low. You know, as we go on, we see this linear increase in the number of submissions, but not necessarily linear increase in the number of available reviewers. So how do we handle this increasingly large gap? And how do we, consistently ask the reviewers to communicate back to the authors to make this process itself a part of the result. That is, the process is not only to filter good papers, but in the reviewing process, the field itself advances as well. Thank you.
So now for the fun part, you get to bring up issues, and then the panels as well as other audience can actually talk about them. That's what we're going to do. And I actually took down some notes which from the as the comments were going on. So let me see if I can put those in so that you have something to look at. Okay, so I just wrote those down, as the discussion points or things that came up in while people were talking about, and then the panel comments is more of a summary. We will start from there, and already see Rich Korf.
Is this mic on? Yeah. So one thing I've noticed over time, both as a reviewer and as an author, is just a subjective experience that the match between papers and reviewers seems to have gotten a little bit worse, and it may be an unavoidable consequence of things scaling up, the number of reviewers going up, the number of papers being submitted. I think it's absolutely critical that, I've gotten often as a reviewer papers I'm completely unqualified to review. I'm much more comfortable, of course, most of us are reviewing papers that we have a lot of expertise, and I think that part which we haven't spoken about very much is absolutely critical, that you get papers in the hands of reviewers that have the most expertise. I don't know how to do it, but I might ask as a question probably to Rao and possibly Khan as well, in terms of what are the processes that are being used for doing paper assignment and how do we do it better?
Yeah, so actually I guess that's one thing that I haven't yet put up, but the reviewing assignment was for each guy was done in a 2-pass process. The first pass, and we used Bly-Bonnes greedy assignment algorithm. In the first pass, only every paper was given up to three reviewers based only on positive bits. That means they said they wanted to read that paper. And then we took this assignment, we extended it up to 4, but in the second phase. But in that phase, we allowed both positive bits as well as matching with the keywords. So there are, if there is a case, and I think I actually had the statistics that was sent to the program committee, something like 98% of the papers got at least 3 reviewers that bid for them positively, and I think in something like 96% got 4 reviewers who bid for them positively. Now, that's revealed preference, and if people bid for it positively and then got the paper and said, oh my god, I didn't really like it, that's something that is a difficult question. But that's how it's done for each guy. Is somebody else, Mike or Chang, want to say anything different?
Does this work? Yeah, right. So last year's process is very similar to this year. So we first ensure that people put in their preferences. We try our best to maximize these satisfaction of these preferences. At the same time, we use the ConfMaster's matching algorithm to do the matching. and then manually patching the long tail, which are not selected by anybody or people who didn't select much.
If I could just add, I think there's many possible improvements to the bidding problem. It's a mechanism design problem that actually some people in our community have done a little work on. I think you can make it a little bit better. Perhaps the problem has gotten harder in our community as we've grown and gotten more specialized. I know my own expertise covers a much smaller fraction of HCI and AAAI than it used to. I don't think it's just me. I think that the matching problem is harder because the universe of people who are really the qualified person to review this narrow contribution at this time is a pretty small set.
So one follow-up on that for next year is we're going to try a couple of new things, but one of them is that in order to improve the matching between reviewers and papers, we are going to use a system developed at the Computer Science Department in Toronto. And basically reviewers will be asked to upload their own papers. And with the paper submitted to the conference, there will be a matching degree established that will help in the bidding process. So that the papers will be ranked according to this matching degree. So the papers that people will first see in order to bid for them will be those that are closely related to their own research. Then still bidding will happen, but it will not be using just the keywords, which has been the traditional way, which sometimes provide a very large amount of papers to bid for, and that hopefully will improve a bit the way papers and reviewers are matched.
Toby?
So I would like the panel to comment on the suggestion, following on from Mike's observation that it's a mad mechanism that we've found ourselves with that brings everything together and then throws everything away at the end. It strikes me as rather wasteful to throw away all the information we learn every time, given that we're going to repeat the conference annually. And there's lots of things that we actually struggle to do, like collect the conflict information that we can clearly learn once off. And then there are other things that obviously need to be treated more sensitively, like the reviewer reliability or the average type of score. I should observe that journals do this, they keep that information, and they work out how to do that sensitively. So it seems to me we're really wasting that wonderful information we collect every time by throwing it away and thinking it's a one-off conference when it isn't.
So I'd like to make one comment in response to that, and I'll let other people talk to. In terms of actually, if we still have the Burning Man style, every year we build a huge program committee from scratch, then there are all sorts of secrecy, privacy issues that will come into play. I am a big fan, currently of standing review boards. IROS, which is a robotics conference, they basically have a standing review board where, it's sort of a JAIR editorial board, but it's like the whole thing is a review board itself. It stays for 3 years with staggered terms, and that makes things much more manageable, and you have a way of tracking people's reliability and all that stuff. I think that would be something that the community should look at at a particular way. Yes. Anybody else wants to say anything? Go ahead.
Just that the Tackle transaction ACL also has this standing reviewing board, so we tap on the expertise of these reviewers who sign up to be this standing reviewing committee. They are committed to reviewing papers that are assigned to them, unless it's a very exceptional situation where they cannot review for some urgent reasons. So this ensures that you have a kind of core group of reviewers that is carefully selected, and there's this continuity over time.
Okay. So I'm generally wondering, this is something that I'm not sure whether it's reasonable to do, but just as a kind of a straw man poll for the community, how many people think something like review boards are things that major conferences should consider? Just raise your hands. You want? Okay, so powers that be, please take note. Okay, Barbara.
Yeah, I wanted, before I make my outrageous suggestions, I want to just make 2 comments on things people on the panel said. First, with respect to anonymity, I know at least one student, not mine, somebody else's, student's paper was rejected out of hand and not reviewed in a past year, not this year, because somebody found a citation on a CV and identified the person. So I think that that harm has happened, and it's a really serious thing. I think it was Massaman who mentioned saying something positive before you get to the negative. If not, I apologize to whoever did it. Kai and CSCW do something like that, and I think it's useful to look. Their reviews, in my experience, are much more helpful than AI reviews. Then three things that I've been asked to say by other people, but because they've come to me about these things. One is people have gotten reviews that say major error without the error identified. I think you should fix the review form so that you cannot check major error without identifying the review. And it should be clear that if you do that, then the major error is going to not be paid attention to. The other thing which I said yesterday in this room at a panel is that I think if papers that report on human subject experiments should be reviewed only by people who have done those experiments. People who have not done those experiments make ridiculous comments like, why did you only have 25 subjects? You should have had 10,000. They have no... I'm not kidding. So let's get serious here. If you have to be an expert in an area to review, you should be an expert in this kind of research to review. And finally, my most outrageous suggestion, which is picking up on reviewers who don't pay attention to the rebuttal, is that authors, if they can show that their rebuttals were not paid attention to, should be able to enter a pool where you simply flip a coin and decide whether the paper is in or out. Given the results that NIPS has shown, that can't be any worse than what's happened. And really, it's ridiculous to ask people to write rebuttals and have them ignored, and it happens all the time.
Okay, so first of all, I just want to clarify that none of this ever happened in IJCAI, so I think she's just talking about it somewhere else.
I should say, I have to answer this. Rao, I have only heard great compliments about this year's IJCAI.
Thank you. So I just want to make sure, I mean, complaints are fine, not about this IJCAI. Go ahead.
None of this happened at IJCAI, this IJCAI, as far as I know.
So can I just respond to one part of that?
Please.
So the last part, as a program chair who spent so much time pleading with reviewers to reflect how they process the rebuttals in their reviews with partial success at best. Let me say that the author does not know actually whether the review rebuttals were considered. I saw so many cases where there was substantial discussion of the rebuttals in the review threads. None of it ever got reflected back in the reviews, again, despite SPC and program chairs pleading to that effect. So I don't know what behavior modification program might be possible to address that, but you, as an author, unfortunately, you're only seeing, you're not seeing all the thought that went into your paper.
So I just want to add, so at least in the AI and web track, because it's a little bit more manageable, we pushed each SPC member to write a meta review highlighting the fact that there was a discussion, and sometimes when the discussion was interesting, summarizing it as well. And also in the discussion phase, we requested the SPC members to